Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. As part of WoW's 20th anniversary event, they added a whole bunch of secret finding elements to the game. So I figured it was a great time to talk about them. But before I actually do that, I wanted to talk about some of WoW's historical secrets. And my notes for this video wound up being massive, so we're probably going to split it into two. This first video will be a retrospective on what I consider the first wave of WoW secret hunting. That is everything from Legion through Shadowlands. And next week's video will focus on what I consider the second wave, that is Dragonflight onwards. I don't really have a thesis for these videos, it's mostly just me reminiscing and commenting on the various secret hunts. But as some general commentary, I just want to say that secrets are some of the most fun elements that the game has included. Unfortunately, they can't come in super frequently because frankly, they can be very hard to implement. First of all, it just takes a decent amount of time to come up with hunts that the player base won't instantly solve. But I also imagine on the programming side, it's just not a very efficient endeavor. You're asking the devs to program very niche interactions and whatnot into the game, often needing to obscure them from data miners and such. So I absolutely get why it would not be a priority, but I'm thankful that Blizz still manages to do it every now and then. And it can just be really fun to actually be there when one of the hunts is going on. It's still fun afterwards, but just not quite as much. As you may already know, the WoW Secret Finding Discord is the place to be if you want to participate or watch one of these hunts go on. I think it was most fun back at the start of Legion when these community-wide hunts first began, just because it was much more of a Wild West situation. We didn't really know what to expect at that point, and it took a lot of us by surprise. So on that note, let's start with the first of the major secret hunts, the Fathom Dweller / Hungering Claw. Again, what made it really fun at this point was the mysteriousness of it all. We just knew that these items were in the journal, but it was kind of ambiguous how you obtained them. The Fathom Dweller, for example, just stated its source as Kosumoth the Hungering. So when Kosumoth first spawned, a ton of players, myself included, flew to the Eye of Azara and killed him ad nauseum hoping for the drop, not understanding at that point in time that that is not how you obtain it. So what's the actual story behind this one? Gradually, the player base discovered some very well hidden caves around the Broken Isles, and in each of these caves was a small orb, sometimes kind of hidden. Seemingly unrelated, on the Broken Shore, you could find Drak Thul, who was a member of the Stormreaver clan and a former underling of Gul'dan. If you played the Frozen Throne, you may remember the side quest he gives you. And his return was interesting enough, but what really stood out was the fact that he also had one of these orbs on his table. Players discovered that after talking to him, a cave on the Broken Shore that was previously blocked off became available. And if you went to the back of the cave, you could find a very tiny and easy to miss clickable item that would give you a weathered relic. After obtaining this, the goal wound up being to go around the Broken Isles and click each of these cave orbs in the right order. And technically, Drak Thul's table gave further hints as he had a map of the Broken Isles with small pebbles placed on top of it in the approximate locations of the caves. Of course, for any individual player, this would still be quite the obstacle, but as it shifted into a community effort, it got solved pretty quickly. Most of the caves were actually pretty straightforward, with the only obstacle being finding the cave itself, though there were a few curveballs, such as one with deadly steam vents that you had to navigate through, or some very strong mobs that you either had to avoid or distract long enough for you to click the orbs. With the last cave being particularly well hidden inside a shipwreck with a very small crack that you had to squeeze through. And once the solution to this puzzle started making the rounds, it became an absolute frenzy among the player base. Because for whatever reason, all of the orbs had an internal cooldown that prevented players from clicking on them for a certain amount of time. So you'd probably wind up server hopping and trying to get ahead of the wave of players, only to get really bottlenecked at the last step anyway. I do think eventually Blizzard hotfixed it to not have that massive cooldown. Anyway, after clicking all 10 of these orbs, a world quest would appear in the open world version of Eye of Azara. This world quest was on a 2-week rotation and would offer up either the mount or the pet. And unfortunately, it was the pet world quest for like 2 months after players solved it, which meant that if it was the mount you cared about and you rushed through this puzzle, you just wound up waiting anyways. So in retrospect, this one could be considered a bit of a mess, but I think just the mystique of it all, combined with the presence of Drakthul, and it all tying into old god stuff, which is innately kind of creepy, made for a genuinely enjoyable experience. It really felt like you were doing something dark and secret and forbidden to obtain these rewards. And in that regard, I think this is actually one of the strongest secret hunts when it comes to pure theming. As time went on, I feel there was more of a shift towards the puzzles themselves, which isn't necessarily a bad direction to go, but I certainly wouldn't mind if they drifted back towards being more atmospheric. Anyways, this first hunt is what really galvanized the secret hunters and caused the Discord server to really take off. So when the second hunt came in, we were a lot more prepared. And this hunt was for the Riddler's Mindworm mount. This one started off by clicking a note in the Legerdemain Lounge in Dalaran, and sent you all across Azeroth clicking various notes until you reached the end. So conceptually very similar to the Fathom Dweller hunt, except this time the clues came individually with each step. Now the secret hunters were able to quickly deduce that the page numbers being used for the notes formed the ISBN for Warcraft Chronicles Volume 1, and so that was to serve as our codex. Each clue wound up being associated with a certain illustration or map that was included in Chronicles, and you would use these pages to logic out where the note might be, and then an army of players would descend upon that location, combing it through to hopefully find the note. And while it certainly did take some effort, it also showed that the community was willing to rise to the challenge that the devs were putting out. And as the Discord had really taken off at this point, it felt like the first hunt where memes became a prominent element. Questions like, have you checked Encourage, or have you tried using Corpse Explosion, became annoyingly common to hear. But still, all in all, a very fun time. Next up, we had the Sundarter Hatchling pet. Seeing as how battle pets aren't really my thing, I didn't actually follow this one, just because the hunts can be quite time consuming and I had other stuff going on. Though funnily enough, I did find the cave where this hunt occurs all on my own. I was just bored one day and flying around Kalimdor, and it's called the Caverns of Consumption. So I flew into it, ran ahead a little bit, and was greeted by a strange fire barrier. So at this point I did look it up and was amused to find that it was tied to a secret. As the name of the cave suggests, the puzzle wound up involving using a whole bunch of different consumable items to get past each step. For example, that initial fire barrier required a major fire protection potion to run through, and there were about 10 such barriers you needed to bypass, with the latter ones getting more convoluted. I never actually bothered to do this one, but it seemed like it would have been a fun time. Maybe one day I'll go back and do it. Next up, we had the Lucid Nightmare Mount Hunt, which I think many players would consider one of the best secrets that they've done. This is because it combined community ingenuity along with personal activity in order to complete it. At first glance, it sort of resembled the hunt for the Riddler's Mindworm, as it started in Dalaran and you followed a series of notes that sent you all around the world. But the major difference is that this one didn't just have you clicking on the note, you had to perform a task to earn each note. The first note sent you to Ulduar, specifically XT002 Deconstructor's room, where there was a small lever on top of one of the trash piles, which when pulled would activate a 20 by 20 grid on the floor, and you had to toggle the right squares of this grid to form a gear, the symbol of Mimiron. It was a little time consuming, but still surprisingly rewarding to do it. Next, you were sent to Encourage, I suppose just to satisfy the meme, where just before Cthulhu's room, you could find a small old god-themed Bejeweled game, which you could solve either by getting 5 Yogg brains in a row, or just hitting some invisible score after a certain point. Next, you were sent below the deepest point, which meant going to Deepholm, specifically the Worm Caves slightly to the east of Therazane's throne, and once there, clicking on a dark fissure which would send you into an even deeper room, and this room became a bit iconic with just how long it kept the secret hunters stuck there. And it wasn't a big room, it was pretty much just a chair with a plaque on the back of it. But I also just thematically like this step because it's cool when you need to go deeper than the deepest place. Anyway, part of the problem with this step was that the plaque on the back of the chair had instructions on it that a lot of the player base interpreted as being the clue to the next step of the hunt. But it wasn't, because it wasn't a note. Instead, what we were supposed to do was take the plaque, form an anagram out of it, which wound up being Raxum Greep, a goblin located in Ratchet, and deduce that you were supposed to wear the same mask that he was wearing. That is to say, a Shadow Weave mask, The problem being that the recipe for that was no longer available in the game since Cataclysm. However, Blizzard had secretly re-added the recipe for that mask to the game and had it dropped from Dark Iron Dwarves in Searing Gorge. And this particular bit of the puzzle wound up being a bit of a black spot, just because the recipe was a 1% drop from those mobs, and suddenly you had a huge Discord server's worth of people farming them trying to get the recipe. Those who did get it often sold the masks on the auction house for exorbitant prices, and if you weren't willing to pay those prices and didn't know anyone who knew the recipe, you just had to farm it out yourself on one of your tailors, and it just sort of schisms the secret hunters between those who had already completed the step and those who were still working on it. Though obviously as time went on, this became far less of an issue. It also wound up not being a huge issue just because of what the next step was, which sent you into Gnomeregan, where you could find a series of consoles that you had to input the correct code into in order to solve. And this step I don't think was particularly fun. It involved a Murloc pet for some reason and the damage of one of its abilities, and it wound up being solved by Chinese players, and I don't really understand it, but it is what it is. After that, you were sent to Val'sharah, where you just have to solve a nightmare-themed untangling puzzle, the same kind we're very used to nowadays. After which, you are directed to Kunlai Summit and the Endless Halls. This was the final step of the Lucid Nightmare, in which you enter a procedurally generated maze which contains 5 rooms with orbs and 5 rooms with runes of matching colors, and you have to navigate this maze, bringing all of the orbs to the runes, at which point you would proceed to the actual final step. Now, the reason this part was so famous was because everyone's version is different, and even your version is different if you leave and come back later, as well as one monkey wrench that greatly complicates matters, especially if you don't know that it's there. So when we all first rushed into the place, we did the logical thing and tried to map it out as we went. And at first everything seems fine. If you're intelligent, you know to leave the orbs where they are so that you can keep them as a landmark until you have the place fully mapped out. But it didn't take long at all for people to realize that something was amiss. And Blizzard later clarified what was going on, and that was that there was a secret trap room. If you happened to stumble into this room, you would be ported to another random room in the maze. The problem being that there was no indicator that you had entered the trap room, so you never knew if you had actually triggered it. And because of this, everybody's maps would get messed up and impossible to follow. If you want to do the maze now, the best advice I can give you is to backtrack. After every uncharted room that you go into, make sure to go back a room or two and make sure that everything lines up with how it should. If you do this diligently, eventually you'll start to get an accurate picture of the maze. Now, when I did it, we didn't know exactly what was throwing everybody off, so after a little bit, I just said screw it and started running. I think I had spent about 30 minutes trying to map it, and then spent another hour when I just said YOLO, so about 90 minutes all in all, which isn't too bad. But I know some players have reported spending upwards of 4 hours in this place, so it can be quite an ordeal. But I maintain that it is a fun ordeal, and one day when I have the spare time, I plan to go back and do it more legitimately. Anyways, after this step, you get one final clue that sends you into the Karazhan Crypts, where you will finally be able to just loot the Lucid Nightmare Mount. All in all, a very fun secret hunt, because even if you go back and do it today, it's a lot more than just following a guide. The next major secret was again one that I didn't actually do, and that was Una, the Draenei ghost girl. I haven't looked at it too closely because it just rewards a pet, but from what I have seen, it is by far the most narratively heavy secret they've implemented, one that can really tug at your heartstrings, and I appreciate that that aspect went into this one, but I can't really offer much more commentary on it. Again, if I have spare time one day, maybe I'll go back and do it myself. That rounds off the major Legion secrets, so let's move into BFA, and the first one, which was Ball. This was a battle pet you could obtain, and paid homage to the Drakthul stones by making that the entire thing you were trying to search out. These were scattered around the new BFA zones, and of course would have been insanely difficult to find naturally, as you're literally looking for tiny little pebbles across 2 continents. Even with a massive search party, that is a tall order. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you view it, the community had new tools at their disposal. There was a way in which you could basically cache the information you were receiving from the game and use that to detect when a new item showed up. So it worked a bit like a rare scanner, letting you know when something new was near, although you still had to manually search to find the exact spot. And some of these were genuinely pretty fun. One such pebble was hidden amongst dozens of fake pebbles just to annoy people, and some were located deep into fatigue waters and you couldn't fly at the time. And that slightly spooky aspect made it feel a bit like the Fathom Dweller hunt, but the fact that you were just searching for pebbles was a little immersion breaking, I have to admit. I also feel like this was the first hunt that really showed the limits of secret hunt design, because it really highlighted that the devs were basically in an arms race against players and their hacks for solving these puzzles. And I think this realization did a lot to form the second wave of puzzles that we would later get. But at any rate, this particular one ended with a pet battle against Baal himself, which did pretty much require someone nearby to have Una out. Thankfully, you didn't have to have her yourself, and this puzzle immediately segued into the next one, which was for the Waste of Time cosmetic belt, which you do have to appreciate just for the punny name. Baal himself gave the initial clue, where you took the capitalized letters and made an anagram out of them that would point to the first clickable object, and this process basically repeated about 20 times over. You find the clickable, it gives you an anagram, you solve that anagram, find the next clickable, and so on and so forth. Which might have been fun if you were there for the wave of it actually happening, but if you happened to be logged off, you would come back and suddenly 12 more steps had been solved. And at this point in the secret hunting history, flying around and clicking on objects wasn't really doing it for me. Anyways, after those 20 clickable objects, you were sent to the coastline of Arathi Highlands, where you interact with the skeletal gnome Grimmy. Players figured out that you had to equip some old crafted cloth gear, and then interact with his various enemies around the world while holding some obscure gray items. And then you go out in his field and click the rotten potatoes 144 times, and then you get the waste. Now, like with Baal, I found this hunt a little disappointing overall. The anagram idea is fun, but the community just blazed through it way too quickly. I mean, there are literally websites designed to just solve anagrams for you. But at the same time, enough of the clues and objects were still obscure enough that you still needed the community to brute force it a bit. And that just wound up putting the puzzle in an unfortunate middle ground, where it felt more like just a bunch of steps you had to execute than an actual hunt. But fear not, dear listener, for our next puzzle hunt, the Hive Mind was one of the best, right up there with the Lucid Nightmare. Things started out simply enough. You just had to equip the Talisman of True Treasure Tracking from Grifta in Shatrath. This may seem random to the uninformed, but Grifta and his items were all objects of heavy theorization in previous hunts. You then needed to acquire 4 different colored monocles, whose locations were hinted at by the objects on the table behind him. There was a red fish that pointed you to Bashir, and here there were a whole bunch of fish traders located around the 3 Bashir zones, and you basically had to zip between them making trades in the correct order, because if you weren't careful, a lot of the items would expire before you were done. Now, if you checked out all of the vendors and their stocks, you could figure out on your own the correct order in which you needed to do this, but of course it took no time at all for a guide to come out and make it easy for you. Next, there was a yellow pyramid that pointed you to the Halls of Origination. Inside of this dungeon, there is a subtle passage you can take to wind up below the elevator, and here you can activate a huge puzzle of constellations that come in 4 different colors, as well as 3 different type of refractors that will rotate the colors of entire groups of constellations. They can toggle them either in cardinal lines, diagonal lines, or just the 4 that are surrounding it. Now, this looks very intimidating at first, and I'm pretty sure there is an add-on that will just solve it for you, but I think it is a dang shame if you do it that way. It was actually pretty fun to solve. All you really have to do is find the one constellation in the puzzle that won't be toggled by any of the refractors and use that as your starting point, because obviously if you can't change that one, everything else needs to be changed to match that one. And so you just start working your way outward, and eventually you start to get the rhythm of it all. This is one of my favorite components they've added to any of the puzzles, and I recommend anyone who hasn't done it to do it. Now then, there was also a green feather that would point you to Skyreach, where there was a console located next to the final boss, and for the overwhelming majority of players, it would be basically impossible to actually logic out the correct solution to this, but funnily enough, it has after the fact become the easiest of the monocles to obtain, because you just have to input a fairly short sequence. And lastly, there was a blue ladder that basically started players on another anagram hunt similar to the Waste of Time. This one can be a bit tedious to get just because there's so much travel involved, but it's technically pretty easy. Now this puzzle wound up being pretty unique in that it required you to form a 5-man group to solve it, and the first overarching step of that puzzle was to get all 4 different monocles in the hands of 4 different party members. Now personally, I have all 4 monocles in my bank, but you don't need to go that far. I'm just a bit of a completionist, and I happen to find this puzzle really fun to lead my friends through if they need it. At any rate, the player base found a doorway inside of Suramar City that was blocked off by 4 colored beams. And you guessed it, they were red, yellow, green, and blue. Players also managed to locate 4 named withered mobs located around the Suramar zone, and the letters on the flavor text of the monocles formed an anagram that spelled out Wild Withered. So clearly you needed to use these withered in a certain way. Now what you did wind up having to do was have your 4 party members who had the monocles spread out and cover their matching withered. This was fairly easy to figure out because their names correspond to the colors of the monocles. You have Rike for red, Blomon for blue, Giluzui for green, and Yorlan for yellow. So these players had to equip their monocles and bring the withered down to 1 HP, at which point they would start to regenerate, and during this period their corresponding bar on the doorway would disappear. So if your group was coordinated and brought them all to 1 HP at the same time, all 4 bars would disappear and the 5th player could make their way into the room. Inside the room there was a cat toy that you could click on that would teleport you outside the room and deal a certain amount of damage to you. How much damage was dealt to you was something you wanted to write down because it would become very important for the next step. Inside of the Court of Stars dungeon, you could find Lady Chatone and her Mana Saber kittens. There were 5 such kittens, and if you talked to Lady Chatone, there was a whole bunch of dialogue options that would give you the extensive history of how she came to acquire the lot of them. You use this backstory to establish the order that she acquired the 5 of them, and then you would correspond those kittens with the digits of the damage that had been dealt to you. The correct order was Mrs. Fluffy Muffins, then Shadow, then Mew, then Ash, and finally Bella. When you pet each of the kittens, you would get a buff lasting 20 seconds, and you basically had to pet each one the correct amount of times to match up with the damage that you had received. If you managed to do this, the kittens would trigger an ominous orb to spawn, and clicking on that would bring you to the next step, the platform puzzle. Now this involved a whole bunch of platforms that would become active or inactive depending on the way you move. And I'm sure there's a certain kind of logic to this, but I believe people just brute forced it and then looked back at the footage so that other people could replicate it. So yeah, for this step, you pretty much just follow a guide. And the last step was the arcane lava crossing the river type puzzle. Basically, there was arcane lava on the floor, and the only way to get across was with the light lock that would travel from one end of the lava to the other. The problem being, you could only cross in certain combinations of players, and you needed to get all 5 players across. Now of note, there was one of the 5 players who would be able to cross with any other single one person, and there was also a single trio of players that could cross together. So your first step was to figure out who's in this trio, and with 5 players there are 10 different possible combinations of 3 players. So you would just try different trios until one of them was successful. So you would write down what this trio was, and then try to troubleshoot which member of that trio was your free agent that could travel with any other player. And you would just figure this out by trying out other combinations until you found your free agent or your ferryman. Now what makes this a bit trickier is that you don't just need a valid combination of players to cross the arcane lava, you need a valid combination of players to come back as well. So first you would have your main trio cross over and dump one of the non-ferrymen off. Then you would go back and swap your other trio member for one of your duds. Go forward again and trade your dud for the other trio member. Go back to the start and pick up your third trio member and cross forward again with your trio. And you're basically repeating yourself here, where you dump one of the non-ferrymen off. Bring the other trio member back, trade them for the dud, bring the dud over, trade them for the trio member, bring that trio member back, and finally you cross with all 3 of your trio members, which I'm sure sounded perfectly clear and super easy to understand. But don't worry, there is a graphic that makes it a lot easier. You basically just need to figure out your ferrymen and your trio members and put markers on everybody. Then follow the graphic and it's pretty smooth sailing. Once you're across the bridge, the 5 of you will surround the hive mind and channel onto it, and you get your special 5-person passenger mount. Unfortunately, those passengers can only be your fellow players that you helped solve the puzzle with, but it's pretty neat nonetheless. And if it's really important to you, you can change which players you can ride with by just solving the puzzle again with those players. And yeah, between this and the Lucid Nightmare, it's really hard to say which has been my favorite puzzle. I think the Lucid Nightmare was probably more fun to do the first time, but I really appreciate about the hive mind that I can go back and help my friends do it and feel like a bit of an expert on the matter. But yeah, they were both phenomenal puzzles. Unfortunately, the hive mind was the last of the super complex community puzzles until the recently introduced Incognito, and it's perfectly understandable why these tapered off. As demonstrated by the ball puzzle, the community was just getting better at solving these things, sometimes through the sheer experience that we were picking up, and sometimes through external tools that the devs probably didn't count on us having, which all in all make the puzzles a lot harder to design and implement. And what I consider the second wave, which started with the Secrets of Azeroth puzzle, was the logical response to the situation that had emerged. But I will get into that in the part 2 of these puzzle videos, which may come out next week. I want to wait until Incognito has been solved, but we've been stuck for 10 days as of this recording on the same step, so we'll see. Maybe part 2 won't come out for another month or so. I also want to briefly touch on some of the smaller puzzles that we've gotten over the years, which are still appreciated but just lack the grandeur of the ones that I really went into depth for. I know a lot of hidden artifact appearances were little puzzles. There was Engineer Omega Plug in Nomergon for the Vial of Green Goo toy. There was using cat food to create music notes in Karazhan to acquire the Jennifer battle pet. There was the Slime Serpent mount in Shadowlands that was a bit of a sore spot. The community had really high expectations for this one, and we're doing fun things like using a Shrek reference in Maldraxxus and connecting it to the lyrics of All Star and hoping that that would serve as a guide, which sounds like it would be crazy fun. But ultimately the solution was just do Mythic Plaguefall on your own and then backtrack to the third boss's area, where the Slime Serpent would just be sitting there waiting for you to click on it. Although it is a bit hilarious because you know there were players that had soloed Mythic Plaguefall trying to figure this thing out, and they just missed it because they didn't go back upstairs. So it was a bit disappointing, but we can't really blame Blizzard for that. They never said it was going to be on the same scale as the other puzzles. And I know there are definitely a ton of other little puzzles like this that I am not mentioning here, but that gives you at least a little bit of a taste. And we will pick this up in our part 2 video. But lastly, our drawing for the week. There aren't really any major lore NPCs tied to the secret hunts, so I just decided to go with Therazane, just because that chair in Deepholm served as such a wall for the Lucid Nightmare hunt. So yeah, what can I say about Therazane? She is, quite the looker. She certainly has the most unique appearance among the elemental lords, but heck, earth elementals are the most unique looking elementals. And I guess in both cases it's just because earth is not as nebulous as fire, air, and water. But all in all, she does have a pretty unique and interesting design. She kind of looks like a fertility idol, and I guess that would make sense. I mean, she's the elemental lord of earth, which is a source of fertility. But yeah, I do like her overall, especially how she just hovers around everywhere. She's probably my second or third favorite elemental lord. I put Alakir on top just because I like his concept the most. So second place either goes to her or Ragnaros for his generically awesome design. And I don't think it's going to happen, but just based on how the cosmology chart is laid out, I think it'd be kind of cool if we wound up seeing an elemental lord of spirit and elemental lord of decay. Those don't really make sense with like the 4 shamanic elements, and there's no precedent for those 2 existing at all, but I don't know, it'd be interesting. And I of course set her right next to Therazane's throne, as you would expect. Well, this was a long one. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.